Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri As you can see, I'm just showing you a really quick preview before we actually start this video tutorial. So today's piece was, as you may have guessed by now by seeing the preview, is the Minotaur. Now, I did look up briefly the mythology on this character, and like I said, very briefly. So I did base a lot of my anatomy off the human anatomy, but just with some trace elements of an actual bull. So when I was working on this piece, I did have my anatomy reference open, but I also had another reference book open at the same time. The main reason for this is that it does include a lot of mythology-based creatures, so it was a very useful reference. Now, I do make it a habit when I do have the opportunity to purchase books that include concept art from movies or video games, because these tend to be very useful for me to get inspiration and to see how other people adapted the common mythologies to suit their own needs. So for this reason, I actually grabbed a book. It's called The Crafting of Narnia, and this book actually stands out compared to most books I've seen in that it actually includes quite a bit of sculpture work. So you see the initial concept stages, but you also see a more rendered version where they're trying to see whether or not anatomically it would actually work. So they actually hire professional sculptors to actually sculpt out these characters before they actually start building these in 3D or spending any more time than they need to on these characters. They also do facial analysis in this book, so it is very useful, especially the sculptural portions, because most people that sculpt have a very strong understanding of anatomy, or at least the professionals in this book did. So, how did I apply this knowledge that I gained through my reference material? Well, in this case, I would look at a lot of, once again, the sculpture pieces in the book, and I would look how they transitioned from a human anatomy to more of an animal anatomy, and how they actually incorporated both of those aspects in the features, especially in the face. So that gave me a starting point from which to work with. So once I had a general idea of how I was going to go about this drawing, I started sketching out a couple of drawings, really quick drawings, to see which one worked best. At this stage, it's all really rough. I'm not too worried about the detail. I'm just trying to figure out the general anatomy. Now, I didn't show all those portions just because there's quite a few drawings I normally go through. This is actually, I'd say, about the second or third attempt at this character. The first two attempts were interesting, but the pose wasn't interesting enough for me to continue with it. And it wasn't until about the third time when I was actually happy with both the pose and the conceptual idea of this character. So that's why you see me starting with a line drawing before I actually work on anything else shading wise, is because I can flesh out a couple of ideas extremely quickly and not be committed fully to the drawing as of yet. These are more of a general guide of where I'm actually going to go. These take the longest though for me to figure out, so I normally spend about an hour going through a couple of different versions before I actually come up with something that I like. So in this case, I went through about 2 or 3 versions before I'm like, oh, that's definitely the pose I'm going to use. And I like the way that motion reads. So the moment I figured out the motion, I normally have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to do anatomy-wise. For me, most of my characters tend to be very human-like, unless you look at my baby dragon video. That was anything but human-like. But I do have a strong preference towards human anatomy. The main reason for that is because I find it very challenging. For me to draw certain poses like this, I actually find it's quite difficult, which is why I enjoy doing them. For me, it's a very good challenge. It's great practice for me. I might include some more animal-based stuff in the future, but for now, I'm really concentrating on the character designs itself. So another good thing about using the reference material is that it also shows me some of the concepts that they went through for the characters' armor designs and clothing designs. Because once again, they're trying to create something that looks very useful and functional, but also very interesting, and that doesn't take away from the character. So seeing somebody else's point of view on how they go about doing that is extremely useful. Now, it doesn't count as actual reference. This type of material is more of something to get me going, something to get me to want to draw. So, because it has already been interpreted in a certain way, I don't count it as an actual reference. So for that, I'll have to actually look at actual anatomy books to get the proper anatomy and structure that I want. Now, as you can see, I've actually struggled quite a bit with the leg that's closest to you, and that's because the pose of that leg and showing that strength in that anatomy was extremely difficult, especially with the foreshortening. So that took quite a few attempts in before I came up with something that I was satisfied with. Typically, that's normally what happens with a pose like this, is I do try to make it very dynamic, but in so doing it also tends to be more difficult to draw, but that's how you learn the most from it. That's why I do tend to draw poses that are very dynamic, is to force myself to learn how the anatomy would move in a certain manner. The only way, unfortunately, to learn that is by practicing it. So for this reason, I do try to really force the poses, especially nowadays, just to make sure that I'm really pushing myself to try and figure out how the anatomy would wrap around in a certain manner. Now, I had a very unusual problem with my brushes for some reason. I did fix it about midway, but my brush was actually turning out very splotchy, and somehow I turned up the dynamics and the transitions for it. I don't know how I managed that, but you could see that I was struggling a lot with the anatomy in the beginning, and a lot of it had to do that my brush settings were actually wrong. Normally the brush settings don't affect me all that much, because I normally just use the default brush settings. But in this case, it was actually creating a very splotchy and unappealing look to the anatomy that I didn't anticipate. So I had to go in and I had to change my brush settings back to the default settings. And once I did that, most of the problems that I had for this character actually resolved themselves. Now, once again, I'm using the default soft brush to do these illustrations for the majority, especially for the character portions. I do find that it gives me a much softer look to the overall character. The only downside with that is I have to go in with a very solid brush afterwards and make sure to sharpen all those edges to make sure that they stand out correctly, and to keep the character from looking too blurry as well. Now you'll notice I'm actually working only on one horn. There is actually a functional reason for that, because I can copy and paste that behind the character to create the second horn, which is what I do later on in the video. So for the majority of the video, you will only see the character having one horn on one side of his head, but that will be changed later on. Now, most of the clothing that I actually added to the character were more of there for design, not actual functional reasons, minus the loincloth. But the clothing around his nose and ears weren't necessary portions, but I did believe that, especially when I was doing this piece, that it gave it a very unique nature to it. Because although he's stuck in the maze, there's nothing stopping him from, trying to look somewhat more interesting. Now, whether an animal actually thinks that way or not, I'm not sure. However, in this case, I wanted the character to have that small human aspect to them. Once again, I'm just sharpening those lines on the outside of the character to make sure that they read correctly before I move on to any more details. Now, because most bulls actually have quite a bit of muscle mass, I did want to really make this character read as if he's half human and half bull. So in order to do that, I gave him almost a bodybuilder's type muscle physique in order to do this. So I made sure that the muscles are super defined, more so than what I would normally do in most characters, just to show and emphasize the fact that he is literally raw muscle and raw strength. Now, I did actually struggle with the perspective as well for this character. I actually had to do quite a bit of changes throughout before I came up with something that I actually liked. My main light source is actually not in the scene as well, keeping in mind once again that it is in the labyrinth. So I wanted to have my light source come from an outside source. The hero in the scene would actually be the one creating the light for this environment. So for this reason, there's no windows in this area. All the light is centered around an unknown area off screen to emphasize the fact that this character is in danger, and you don't know from what. So you don't know if he's actually the good guy or the bad guy necessarily, and that was done on purpose. Once again, I'm just tweaking the background. I'm not quite happy with it yet. I'm getting there though. So I'm just working out the background silhouette to really make this character pop. Okay, so I've just added my basic color, and this helps set the tone for the rest of the palette. All the other colors that I choose tend to be chosen to fit that initial color. Another reason why I chose that color was that if the light is coming from a torch, I do want it to read as if it's actually coming from a torch, so I added a lot of yellows to it. Later on you'll see some of the additional colors added in as well, just to emphasize that. Now, although the majority of the light in this scene is yellow, it is important to add some additional colors just to make the character really pop out from the background so he doesn't fade into too much, or he doesn't meld into that background. As you can see, what I did is I actually just duplicated that portion of the head to create the horns, so that you would have the two horns there. This piece is actually almost done. Now, there was actually quite a bit of changes that I did to sharpen the overall character and the overall scene that I don't actually show in this video. So we'll actually be transitioning right now to it. So as you can see, I added additional details to the ground as well as to the character itself to make those aspects pop out from the background. So I hope all of you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you and take care.